I mean, I could tell you stories about the first time I saw my host dad pop in a pouch of something into this device and press some buttons, and all of a sudden, you had the smell of popcorn. It felt like a scene from the Jetsons because I didn't know what a microwave was. The war kind of reached its peak at the most inopportune time for me. And any one of those things would have been hard. Raising small children, difficulties in whatever your personal relationships are. Obviously, war. And then of course starting a new career as an academic, which can be very stressful. The best advice that I got as a very young academic in my first year of my PhD studies by John King, who eventually moved on to become Dean of the Business School at the University of Michigan.
Welcome to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast, where we talk to computer scientists who immigrated from their home countries for study or for work or for other reasons. In these oral history interviews, you will find established and renowned computer scientists from across academia and industry narrating their experiences of immigrating from where they grew up to a completely different land, often the US. My name is Indy Gupta, and I'm your host. I'm delighted to welcome Nenad Medvidovic to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast. Nenad Medvidovic is a professor in the Computer Science Department at the University of Southern California, where he's also the Vice Chair for Tenure Affairs in the department. He works in the areas of architecture-based software development and mobile computing. He's one of the leaders in the software community, especially in the International Conference on Software Engineering, also known as ICSE or ICSE. He's editor-in-chief of the IEEE Transactions of Software Engineering, the flagship journal in his area, and he's the chair of the ACM Software System Award Committee. He's former chair of the Special Interest Group on Software Engineering, SIGSOFT, and his work has won multiple Most Influential Paper awards, including at ICSE. He's won many awards. I'm going to just mention a few of them here. The NSF Career Award, the Okawa Foundation Research Grant, the IBM Real-Time Initiative Faculty Award, the Orange County Engineering Council's Distinguished Engineering Merit Award, and just recently the ACM SIGSOFT's Distinguished Service Award. Nenad is also known for his mentorship. He's won the USC Mellon Mentoring Award. Nenad has graduated 18 PhD students since 2004 who are now spread out in academia, research labs, and industry. Nenad did his PhD from University of California, Irvine in 1999. Before that, he received his BS in Computer Science, summa cum laude, in 1992 in Computer Science and Engineering from the Arizona State University. And before that, Nenad grew up in Yugoslavia in the 1970s and 1980s. Welcome, Nenad, and thank you for willing to share your story with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your childhood. Let's start at the beginning. Where did you grow up and how was that like?
I was born toward the end of the 1960s, so it was a touch of the 1960s as well, which I don't remember. I grew up in what at the time was named, the city was named Titograd, which was the capital of Montenegro. The city is now named Podgorica. Since the dissolution of Yugoslavia, many of the cities kind of went back to their historical names, and this was one of those changes. It's still a little bit weird for me to think of my hometown under that new name. We considered it a socialist country, and in fact, the word socialist was in the name of the country. But in the West, even to this day, it is sometimes referred to as a communist country. And one of the things for people who are familiar with that sort of societal, I guess, and governmental organization, you would know that the government put a lot of stock in educating the population. So one of the things that happened in my country, which no longer exists, was that soon after the Second World War, they went on this campaign that pretty much eliminated illiteracy, for example. So education was very important, which kind of flies in the face of this common assumption that, in fact, under communism, they wanted to control the population. So somehow you have to reconcile the fact that they wanted us highly educated and at the same time that there was indeed a certain level of control.
What was schooling like in those days? I understand that Yugoslavia back in those days had two kinds of schools, trade schools and gymnasiums. Which one did you go to among those?
So by the time I finished elementary school, which in the US, that would be the combination of elementary and middle school. So in other words, by the time I finished 8th grade and was ready to go to high school, the country was experimenting with a model of high school education where you would do 2 years of kind of general high school education, and then you would move into, essentially it would be like a college major, but at the level of high school. So the first 2 years would be kind of shared by everybody, and then the subsequent 2 years people would do things like math or biology or programming or English or whatever. So I went to what was traditionally a gymnasium, but at that time it was really kind of switched over to this new system, and it was shared really across all these various schools, including many of the trade schools. So you could have gone to what traditionally was a technical school, for example, that would be geared toward tradesmen or tradespeople, I suppose, and engineers. But those students would have the same basic kind of education that I would get. Just the schools were not as highly regarded necessarily still. But anyway, so that experiment lasted for some number of years and eventually was scrapped because my own high school education my experience was very fragmented. Not only because of that, also because after my third year of high school, I actually left and came to the US. We can talk about that later.
Yeah.
But I think this 2+2 business is very kind of unsettling for somebody. You kind of never got to hit your stride, and also the narrowly focused kind of very intensive education in a given area. Maybe it does have some merit to it, but it was a little bit too early. At the age of 16, for example, you started focusing very, very deeply into or onto a given topic or set of topics. And it was an interesting pedagogical experiment that I think many people would say was not a particular success.
Did the experiment finish, or was it ended while you were there, or did it last past when you were there?
It lasted a handful of years after that. Since I left the country and finished high school in the US, I don't exactly remember. And of course, soon thereafter, the country kind of disintegrated and there were all those wars and whatnot in the 90s. I don't remember exactly whether there was just a decree that kind of brought everything back how it was before. So you had a 4-year gymnasium, for example, or a 4-year trade school, or whether that sort of just kind of petered out on its own and sort of organically went back to the old system.
You got to experience it for 1 year before you came to the US.
Yes. So I, at the end of my, what would be the equivalent of the sophomore year as a high school student, I actually had to decide which of these tracks I wanted to go to. So essentially which major I wanted to pick. And I mean, for me personally, it was the decision was between math and programming. I just happened to pick programming, which my parents were not thrilled about at the time. But then I was in that track for 1 year. My friends who stayed behind when I moved over here, they did it an extra year after that. But again, as you might imagine, 2 years is really, it's sort of like the worst of all worlds, because you don't really get a deep immersion. 2 years goes by really quickly. And at the same time, you lose out on the kind of the more general education and kind of the breadth maybe of some kind of intellectual experience, for example, that you might get in a traditional gymnasium.
Your parents were not thrilled about you picking programming. Why?
So my mom is an engineer by trade, and my dad was an economist. So they both had to study a fair bit of math. And they felt that math was kind of the sort of the pinnacle of the kind of as an intellectual pursuit. Programming, on the other hand, at that time, first, it was very kind of new and exotic. People didn't understand it. And also, there was this kind of thought process that suggested that, well, if you're going to build computers or build robots or whatever, that's a real science or a real engineering endeavor. But if you're just going to program, you take a 2-3 month course and you can already program. In other words, it's really no different than being a plumber or an electrician or whatever, which in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that, being a plumber or electrician. But that's not what my parents thought I should be doing. And on top of that, I think it was really badly misguided. Of course, that kind of mindset exists even today, right? Even today, you'll meet people who basically think you can just kind of pick up some JavaScript on the side and get a job, and it'll, you got yourself a career kind of thing. And why would you need a 4-year degree or 4 plus whatever else you do after that, etc. It's kind of interesting that actually dates all the way back to the mid 1980s.
So your parents saw it as a vocation or a trade, while you picked it because you were interested in it. Had you already done programming by then that interested you?
I picked it because it was new. It was, I had read about programming. I had not done programming. I didn't have any kind of equipment on which I could do programming. I didn't get my first computer until late into my junior year in high school. And that was a Commodore 128 that my dad's brother brought in from Germany. I chose it for that reason, because it was new. It felt like it was the kind of the vocation, I guess, of the future. But I also chose it because my best friend was thinking of going into programming. So it was our chance to, because we had spent 8 years in elementary school together and we were really close. And then the first 2 years in high school, the general 2 years, we were split apart into different homerooms. And then this seemed like an opportunity to kind of get back together and kind of rekindle the friendship, if you will. So there was sort of a dual kind of motivation there. In the end, it was a kind of a snap decision that my parents were unhappy about, but it ended up kind of it sort of set the path for the rest of my life, it seems like.
So you got your first computer when you were in pretty late in high school. And what was the first language or programming language that you learned?
So just like I think most people back in those days, BASIC was the language that you sort of got your feet wet with. It was. I got the computer. My parents were, on the one hand, theoretically excited about the fact that I got the computer, but then I also remember my mom being really disappointed that you actually had to plug the computer into the TV, because that meant that I would usurp the TV and nobody else would be able to watch it. So I did not have that computer for very long, or rather, I had that computer, but I was not able to use the computer for very long because soon after I got it, I ended up moving to the US. So the computer just sat there. I think that somewhere in my parents' storage room, it probably still, is gathering dust, but I have not used it in easily 30 plus years.
So you first visited the US in 1986?
Correct.
86, and that was as an exchange student. Tell us more about that.
Sure. So in late 85, there was an announcement at my high school that some number of students were going to be able to go to the US through this exchange program and that we should apply. So I went through the whole process, and I don't want to bore you with the details of that, but it involved a huge amount of paperwork, as you might imagine, and some psych exams and things like that to,
So it was competitive.
It was competitive, and also they wanted to make sure that, at the time I didn't understand why, but in retrospect, of course, that you're suitable for being separated from your family for that long. And, I got, the first time I saw a Rorschach test was when I was 17. I had just turned 17 and I was going through this test, and the psychiatrist had to sign some paperwork and whatnot. And then based on all that, they found a family in the US who was interested in having a foreign exchange student whose kind of background and wishes, I guess, matched mine. And that's how I ended up in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Scottsdale, Arizona. And you went to school there for a year?
Yeah, in the fall of 1986, so sometime late August, early September, I don't remember the exact date, I started attending as a high school senior, Saguaro High School in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was a completely different experience. Everything was different. Nothing was the same. Not the least the language, obviously, which I did not really speak at the time. But also the fact that you only took whatever it was, 6 classes, but you took them every single day. So there was much less variety in the material you were studying, but huge amounts of it. So when it was initially explained to me, for example, that typically on Fridays we have tests, that seemed really weird to me, because there was no way that in Yugoslavia we would have covered enough material in a week's time, because we met maybe 2 or 3 times a week, to have a test every week. Here it was just a sprint, and it would not end for the duration of the whole semester kind of thing. So it was a very interesting experience. That was by far the kind of the most I have been, or the farthest I should say, I have been outside my zone of comfort ever in my life.
Were there other challenging aspects in that transition time, the first few days, weeks, months?
So obviously being away from everything I knew. I mean, I could tell you stories about the first time I saw my host dad pop in a pouch of something into this device and press some buttons, and all of a sudden, you had the smell of popcorn. It felt like a scene from the Jetsons, because I didn't know what a microwave was. Not only did I not know how one works, but I had no idea what one was. I didn't know that thing existed, right? So it was things like that where I had to sort of pick up my jaw off the floor repeatedly and kind of remember to just sort of act cooler than maybe I was feeling on the inside. But quite frankly, the biggest mistake I made was because of this kind of silly pride, I guess, that you have when you're around 18. I was almost 18 at the time. When my host mom went with me to sign up for classes, which is something you didn't do in Yugoslavia, so I didn't understand the process at all. I didn't appreciate that that's basically the next year of your life. I was sitting in a room with a person whose role in my life I couldn't appreciate, I didn't understand. Turns out he was a high school counselor. Again, this is a concept we did not have back in Yugoslavia. And at one point, they were discussing things. So my math, that was really easy. Science, I had taken so much of it that I didn't have to worry about it. World history, I had taken a bunch of, so they put me into a U.S. history class. So all of this was kind of straightforward. It sort of fell out of kind of my background and what needed to be done for me to actually get a high school diploma. But then at one point, they turned to me and asked, you understand what we're saying, right? Something to that effect. And of course I didn't, but I was embarrassed to say that I didn't, so I just nodded my head and said yes. And they ended up putting me into college composition. Which was probably the toughest class that you could throw a non-native, actually almost a non-speaker into, and that was by far the most challenging thing. Was kind of understanding the language. I had a wonderful teacher who, for the first maybe 3 months of the first semester, would just give me check marks because. He said my English was so poor that just on that basis alone, he would have had to fail me. So that was incredibly generous of him. The class itself turned out to be pretty fantastic. I learned a lot about writing because the entire class was conceived around the concept of being able to express an idea and write an essay and so on. And of course, just like you, I spent most of my professional life writing. So that really kind of put me on a very good path toward where I was eventually going to get to. But the beginning was just so bizarre. Like you go, and I didn't know how to take notes. I had grown up knowing how to write both, obviously, Cyrillic and Roman or Latin alphabets. but I had gotten used to writing Cyrillic. And when I came to the US, I had to switch to Latin, which was not a problem because I knew them both and I used them equally. And I had taken several years of English back home. But my handwriting was so poor because I'd never actually practiced it. I printed Latin. So now I had to take all my notes really fast using this script, the English script. And even to this day, my handwriting is atrociously bad because of that. And I go back to when I go to my parents' house, occasionally I'll look at my notebooks back from like third or fourth grade or whatever. My cursive in Cyrillic was so beautiful. And now, basically, I'm probably the only person who can read my own writing in the whole world. It's that bad.
To cope with these challenges in that first year, did you build a friend circle around you who helped you? Did your host help you? Did your parents kind of counsel you from far away? How did you cope with that? Seems pretty stressful.
Yeah, well, on the one hand, it's stressful. On the other hand, you're so young and everything is just so new, and you decided to take on this challenge and to go into this adventure. So in a way, it was everything you could possibly have hoped for, right? So I had some friends. They tried to, because of the exchange program that I was in. It had a club at our school. There were a couple of other students, and then there were a bunch of other students in the Phoenix area. We would get together, I think, once a month. So there was a little kind of support group there. There were people in school. In fact, I connected with a gentleman maybe after COVID started, so within the last year, give or take, who helped me actually in my U.S. government class. He was incredibly nice to me, and we'd completely fallen out of touch. We were never actual friends, but within that class, he was somebody who kind of sort of took an interest in maybe, he pitied me a little bit or something, because that class was also incredibly hard for me. I couldn't understand. It wasn't the material that I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand the concept of taking a class on the principles of a country's government. That's just not something that could, penetrate my engineering skull, I suppose. So I had people who would step in and lend a hand, and it was so in that sense it was a very positive experience. One thing that was completely unfamiliar to me that this guy Scott that I mentioned kind of sensitized me to is this notion of extra credit. Because to me it was weird that on a test I would get a C because half the questions I couldn't even understand initially. And my grade for the class would be C. Scott would get a C on the test, but his grade would be a B or an A. So, what's the difference? And then he explained that, when the teacher says you could do these things for extra credit, you do them and you actually get more points. And, it was just a lot of this stuff that was, sitting in a courtroom in downtown Phoenix, for example, to get credit for my U.S. government class, and just kind of watching what the criminal defense attorneys and the prosecutors say and so on for a couple of hours. That was just not something that seemed normal to me, but I got the hang of it quickly.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast interview with Nenad Medvidovic, computer science professor at USC and immigrant from Yugoslavia. Did you get to learn computer science and programming during that 1 year?
I did. So the first thing that was very cool to me is that the family, my host family I stayed with, they had two computers. Both of them were IBM PCs, and both of them had the dual 5.25 inch disk drives, which that was, just so futuristic, right? That's another scene from the Jetsons for me. So that was pretty amazing. Obviously the biggest obstacle there was that I didn't know how to type. Typing with one finger, that was not fun. As an elective in school, I got to take programming. Since I had taken programming before, but we did my entire junior year in Yugoslavia, we did it without computers. So we were basically coding by hand and drawing flowcharts and things like that. So a lot of kind of good practice for when you eventually get a computer, I suppose. There were two classes. One of them was called computer science. The other one was called computer programming. And I got put into the latter one. And that one was basic again, which I was somewhat familiar with. The other class, computer science, was Pascal at that time. And to me, Pascal sounded like rocket science, right? So that entire year, I was, so for the 2 semesters, I was in the computer programming class, and sort of honed my skills as a programmer significantly, and much more than I would have been able to if I'd stayed back home at the time.
Sounds like you had an easier time with the math class and the computer science and programming class than with the English or government classes. Is that a correct statement?
Absolutely. I mean, math was, so I was immediately put into calculus, AP, which I didn't know. The concept of AP meant nothing to me, but that was a lot of fun. It was, challenging in the right ways. I could, you could talk numbers easily. That's super easy. Same thing with programming, but English, eventually, since I was a good writer, and one thing that even nowadays my students sometimes can't understand, the command of the language is one aspect of writing, but really it's sort of the logical laying out of the concepts and the ideas is just as important, the structure of what you're trying to say. Or as my English teacher from that year, Mr. Stewart, used to say, form follows function. That was the one thing that he repeated 5 million times during that year. So English eventually I kind of, or what they called college composition, I got the hang of, but U.S. history, very hard for me, because the level of intricate detail was a little startling, because I took history basically from 6th grade through my junior year. And there's a lot of history to cover, and the Romans and the Greeks, and then a lot of Yugoslavian history and all this stuff. But here we would spend huge amounts of time just discussing like a 3 or 4 year period within the history of the U.S. And that level of detail was hard for me to ingest, given the language barrier and also the cultural barrier. I just did not grow up with this. Every day getting up, it was in my math class, in fact, getting up and saying the Pledge of Allegiance. That was the other thing that was just, like what is it that we're doing here? Government was very difficult for me. Econ was somewhat easier. So I had to take 1 semester of government, 1 semester of econ. It was somewhat easier, but I do have to say that I felt a little uneasy about the level of what I felt at the time was indoctrination into kind of the capitalistic mindset. Basically the kind of the notion that Adam Smith had it all figured out and this is the gospel, right? And then everything else kind of falls out naturally. That was to my kind of young uneducated mind, that was an interesting set of concepts to sort of work through and figure out how I reconcile them with everything I'd learned prior to that in my life, and this kind of more socialist point of view where you sort of help the weaker ones and the profit is not kind of the end all be all and so on. But anyway, I think I also
feel like because Yugoslavia was not a part of the USSR and not allied with the Eastern Bloc, and it was part of this non-aligned movement. However, it was a little bit more socialistic than the US was. So it sounds like that was a clash in your mind against.
Right. I mean, there was this running joke back in Yugoslavia because obviously nobody was there was a lot of equality. Nobody was significantly richer than anybody else, at least among the people that I knew and grew up with. It turns out that there were people who were better off. I just didn't know them. So we all thought that we were just kind of equal, right? And people are always complaining how there isn't enough money, right? I mean, on the other hand, your sort of basic existence and healthcare and reasonably comfortable family vacations at the seaside and so on, that was all guaranteed, right? But there was this running joke that you can't pay me as little as I can work little. Okay, in the sense that the amount of underpay that I receive is always going to be less than the amount of underwork that I'm going to deliver, in a sense. So that was kind of the running joke that kind of summed up the socialist sort of mindset and why the whole thing probably fell apart. Coming into the U.S., it was very different, right? Here, people are incredibly driven, work long hours, including my host parents. sometimes evenings, weekends, things like that. That was not something I had been used to.
Towards the end of this first year that you visited here, were you looking forward to going back, or were you really liking staying here?
Well, I liked the U.S. I liked, the first year was not realistic, just to make it clear. I had a host family. I didn't have to worry about many things. I was in high school, so I had to study and whatnot. But I'd met a girl who I fell in love with, so that was also, a nice sort of cherry on top kind of thing. Of course, I wanted to go back home and visit my family, but I also realized that I really liked programming, and I really like computer science actually, and some of the things and concepts that we're learning. I felt like if I were going to study that, the US is the place to be for me at that time. Nowadays, there are other options obviously as well for kids from that same region. But of course, also everybody has a laptop and multiple mobile phones and whatnot, smartwatches, etc. So the world has completely changed. But back in those days, my own exposure to computing was helped by the fact that my family could afford to get me a Commodore imported from abroad. But most of my friends' exposure was reduced to a mainframe and stacks of punch cards that we got to see at the local computing center at the university. So it was it was just a very different time, and from that standpoint, I felt like professionally it would have been the right thing for me to come back to the U.S.
So you went back and then you did one more year of schooling in Yugoslavia?
No, actually, I got my high school diploma here. And I was, so that's why I had to take all these weird classes just to make sure I satisfy the requirements. So you have to take a certain amount of English, a certain amount of science, a certain amount of math, and so on. And they basically found a way of counting all the classes I'd taken in Yugoslavia for all of those other requirements. And this is why I had to take government and econ and U.S. history. And those are the three classes that kind of I would not have been able to take anywhere else. Then English, of course, another year of English was required, another year of math, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, long story short, I was able to graduate high school here. When I got back there, I was actually enrolled in a university in Belgrade. At that point, just like not all, but most of my friends, I went to serve in the Army, just to kind of get that out of the way. So it became customary to take care of your Army obligation, which was 1 year at the time, 1 year long, to take care of that right after high school before you start college for young men. Women could go into the Army on a voluntary basis, but men had to actually serve, barring some sort of chronic illness or whatever. And I wanted to get it out of the way because I didn't know if I was going to be able to come back to the U.S., obviously to go to school, but also because I was a patriot. I felt like, this is something you do. You sort of give back to your country, take care of that, and, then we'll see about the rest of my life.
So was that 1 year in the military, was that more like drills, like the kind we see on TV, or were you able to get out of some of that with your programming and computer skills?
So, not really. That was the weird thing. Everything was still, the Army was still, very much in the 1970s, 1960s mold. There wasn't really very much automation. Computing was not something that had taken over yet. And I actually don't know at which point it got modernized to that level. I know that, for example, people who were in the Air Force, or the equivalent of the Air Force, and people who were, for example, in the artillery perhaps, and so on, they might have had certain kinds of automation. I was in telecommunications, and in fact, I learned how to type in the Army because I was put on a teletype machine. So for the first 6 months, in addition to kind of basic training, which was the drilling, the shooting of guns, and so on, digging your own trench, that kind of thing, so you can protect yourself from the enemy. In addition to that, I spent actually a majority of my time learning how to type. because that was the teletype machine, and the secret codes was what I was supposed to, in principle, be doing. Never did that the second 6 months because I was just given a different job. So once the basic training was over, I moved on and worked at the entrance to the barracks. So I would basically just sign people in and out. Basically, it was a good job for a young soldier, because I also had a permit to leave the barracks whenever I wanted to. Right, that was. But anyway, so it wasn't exactly the most productive year of my life. The combat skills that I learned were not. I mean, they were somewhat limited, because I wasn't I wasn't an infantryman or a paratrooper or whatever. And also a teletypewriter or teletype machine. That's really old technology, so that fell out of use pretty soon thereafter. But on the other hand, I learned how to type, so that was I guess somewhat of a benefit.
Did the discipline that you exercised during that 1 year, did that have an effect on your life or your work in long term?
It was required, right? It was mandatory. So none of us chose to be there. So a lot of that year boiled down, and you have a bunch of 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old boys, basically. So a lot of it is, figuring out a way of playing a prank on one another, or figuring out a way of literally kind of subverting the whole aspect of discipline that was supposed to be imposed on us by the officers. So waiting for them to kind of look the other way so you can do something that would break the rules or whatever. So it was kind of an interesting dynamic that developed over time. For me, the one thing that I still to this day kind of take away from that experience is that I just was, and it wasn't just me, I think all of us were so severely sleep deprived during that year, because I think at that age you really need a lot of sleep, and that was the one thing that was just not an option. With the guard duty where you have to be up every 4 hours, and for 24 hours in a row, every 4 hours you're up basically, and you're standing somewhere with a gun resting off your shoulder for 2 hours in the cold and the rain, whatever. That kind of thing was, there would always be something that would cut into your sleep time. So the one thing that I can remember from, you go home for a few days, you get to leave for a few days, you go home and you sleep. That's kind of what you end up doing. So it wasn't, it was almost like, you can think of it, and I sometimes feel like that's how many of us perceived it. It was sort of a mandatory, kind of a necessary evil, almost like a jail sentence in a low security, like a minimum security prison kind of thing.
And the wars of the 1990s were not even on the horizon at that point.
For idiots like me, no. So I was born. I come from an ethnically mixed marriage. I was raised as a Yugoslav. I saw none of it, probably because I didn't want to see it, because for me that was not an option, right? It's just now everything is an option, because you realize at some point that your entire worldview sort of crumbles. But back in those days, thinking of your country as a place that could actually fall apart, the way it did, was just not something that would penetrate my skull. I do remember, so I was in Slovenia, that's where I served, in Ljubljana, and there were street protests and so on. There was the current, I think, Slovenian prime minister or foreign minister or something. He was caught, I forget all the details to be honest with you, but he was accused of divulging state secrets to somebody or to a journalist or something like that. And he actually had to appear before a military tribunal, and there were lots of people on the streets, and it was very tense for us who were in the army at the time. And I remember there was a kind of a buzz about how Slovenia was just going to break off. And to me, that was just, it was crazy talk. Like, it was just completely unconscionable. But there were people who saw it way before I did. And now, you read these reports and scientific studies of some of this really kind of going back years, if not decades, prior to the dissolution of the country. So I was just young and naive.
So after serving in the military, then you decided to come back to the US. And I think you indicated earlier that that is something you thought you definitely wanted to do. Is that what pushed you, or were there other factors that made you decide to come to the US again?
No, so I liked it here a lot. I wanted to come back. I wanted to go to school if I could. As I said, there was a girl that I'd fallen in love with that didn't quite work out, as you might imagine, as these things happen, the way I was hoping. Nonetheless, that was another kind of added impetus. And, it was just one of those things where I just felt this weird attraction to the place. And I was willing to do whatever was within my power. Of course, whatever was legal. I wasn't going to, just kind of come here and on a tourist visa and overstay it or whatever. I don't judge people who do that kind of thing. It just wasn't me. I was too much of a straight shooter. That's kind of how my parents brought me up, at the time at least. I just wasn't willing to kind of risk bending the rules where I could be kicked out of the country, midway through my studies or whatever. It was just too much of a risk. So I was kind of trying to do it by the book. But I really wanted to come back.
And your parents were supportive of this?
Not really. So my mom, I think to this day, has issues with me having come back and sort of leaving the family behind. I think when the war started for a little while, I think she was glad that I was here, so I wouldn't be conscripted and sent to fight wherever. But generally, she's had a hard time with it, to be quite honest with you. And I, as a parent, of course I understand it. But on some level I understand it. But I felt like, and I still feel, that was, for me, that was the best decision I could have made.
Was the second time coming back to the US easier than the first time?
No, actually, in some ways it was harder, because the first year was a fairy tale. I mean, I was an exchange student. They organized everything. I was supposed to be here for 10 months. Everything was set up so that those 10 months are going to be as impressive to a young person as possible. So they really pulled all the stops to make sure that you saw the U.S. in the best possible light. They would organize bus trips for us, and things like that. And of course, I had a cohort of 40 some odd foreign exchange students from all kinds of places in my city, so I could rely on them. They could rely on me for help and so on. Coming back, I was coming back on my own. I was, the only plus, well, two really. One of them was I kind of knew how the place worked because I'd already been here. So college, for example, is in some sense an extension of high school, because you get to pick your classes and have some flexibility as to which classes you can take to fulfill various requirements and so on. Not something that you could do back home. Or you could have done back home at that time. And then the other thing was, by that point, my mastery of English had reached a certain level, maybe not as I wasn't where I am today, but I could speak it and write it much, much better after that first year. The first year was incredibly helpful in that regard. Everything else was, you basically have to get a job now. You have to figure out how to pay for tuition. So I had my room and board covered by my host family, who took me back in. But then for the rest of it, I had to get creative.
So the tuition payment, how did you manage that? Because U.S. universities are pretty expensive.
At that time, it wasn't that bad. So my first semester cost $2,601, $2,601, I remember that still, because I had to pay back that money. So I borrowed that money, and then I worked. So somehow, you scrounge up enough money. I do have to say, with my the help of my girlfriend at that time.
This was the same girl you had met earlier.
Yeah, we were still together. We eventually, several years later, we got married and had 2 kids. So eventually, she was my spouse, and then now my ex-spouse. So she did help some as well, and I ended up doing what was necessary. It was so one thing, for example, that I was just talking to a colleague about this a few days ago. one thing that I knew coming in was that there was this thing called the Arizona Regents Board of Regents Scholarship for international students. And two of those were given each year. And there were, as you might imagine, thousands of international students in the university system in Arizona. And my plan was I was just going to get one of those two. And you had to, which is really dumb. Like if my kids told me that that's their plan for success, I would, I would fight tooth and nail to dissuade them, right? That's not what that's not a recipe for success. That's not what you do because the probability that you'll be one of those two is so small. But somehow at that age, you just don't think about maybe the risk analysis is not as advanced. And I just decided that was what was gonna happen. So I kind of did the math, figured out I'm gonna have to cover the first 3 semesters of my tuition. And then I'm gonna get this scholarship, which was 4 semesters. I'll just have to graduate in 3.5 years. I'll figure it out, right? And in the end, I did figure it out. I would be really scared to try something like that again nowadays. And it's actually pretty irresponsible because the likelihood of that succeeding was very low. But, my 3rd semester in, I applied for the scholarship and I knew I had to get straight A's because it was all based on grades. And I got lucky. That's, I'm sure there were other students with straight A's who had also applied and I just got chosen. So that took care of the rest of my undergrad. So that did simplify things. It was kind of a moment where I could just take a deep breath and sort of figure out what to do after that. I could kind of plan a little bit further into the future.
It sounds like it's part of your DNA to take these leaps of faith, courageous leaps of faith, not knowing how you're going to accomplish what you want to accomplish, but knowing what you want to do. Is that a correct statement?
On some level, yes. Another way of thinking about that is, because, I'm sure just like you do, I think about where I am in my career and why I've gotten here and what's been going on. And yes, there are these sort of tactical leaps of faith that I will take, but the strategic vision is sometimes missing, meaning that I'll just arrive somewhere through a set of steps and those are, maybe it's a decision making process that results in a bunch of local optima. But as a result of that, because there's always kind of this whirlwind of activity and I have to think about where I am and what's coming up next and so on, I have felt over the years that maybe the flip side of that is that I haven't really been able to sort of take a deep breath, assess the situation, and figure out, this is where I want to be 5 years from now. I have never done that in my life. I can tell you where I want to be a year from now. 5 years from now, that seems like totally, it's sort of like with COVID. Actually, it's worked great for me. I mean, the whole thing has been a tragedy, but what has worked great for me is the fact that I realized early on, you just can't plan more than a couple of months in advance. Even now, we had a conversation this morning about whether this one event with some colleagues, about whether this one event is going to be entirely virtual. And it's like, yeah, that's 2.5 months from now. There's no way we can plan it any other way because we've had all of these plans from government agencies and conference organizers and so on. And, 1.5 years plus into the pandemic, we're basically canceling all of these in-person plans and everything is still remote. So in that sense, this sort of sequence of tactical decisions and maybe tactical wins for me seems to have worked okay because I've gotten where I am right now. But if you had asked me early on, how do you go from here to there? I wouldn't even know where there is. Sometimes you just, as I like to say, sometimes you just have to rip off the Band-Aid. It's going to hurt for a second, but it's probably going to be better in the long run.
Yeah, it's always interesting how one's research philosophies or even life philosophies form at a somewhat young age, even though one doesn't realize it in a sense. And I can certainly see that happening in this case. You're listening to the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast interview with Nenad Medvidovic, computer science professor at USC and immigrant from Yugoslavia. So returning to your timeline, so now you're in Arizona State and you're going through your undergrad. And at the same time, of course, there is quite a bit happening in your home country as well. So I want to ask about two things. One is, how did you get interested in research? And then how did you deal with, this other world where your parents are and it's quite getting quite turbulent out there?
That was very difficult. At that time, there was a TV station called Scola, which you might actually not remember because you're younger than I am. It was, and certainly, telling kids nowadays what it was like is it's just this imaginary world that they can't comprehend. There was no internet. There was basically, we had just started using email, and that was the select few who were in places of higher learning and so on. And Scola was, and then I was still writing letters back and forth with my parents. So, a letter would take somewhere between 7 and 10 days to arrive. Sometimes it wouldn't arrive for a month. Sometimes it wouldn't arrive at all. So getting information back and forth was very difficult.
Did you call them? Or did you speak on the phone?
Yeah. Calling them was very tricky because
expensive too, I guess.
AT&T had a plan that a minute would cost over $2, which at that time was unimaginably expensive for me. But on weekends, so Saturday morning after 2 a.m. and Sunday morning after 2 a.m., it would be like 84 cents a minute or something like that. So many late Saturday nights, early Sunday mornings, I would force myself with the aid of coffee, sometimes Vibrant, in fact, to stay up. So sort of medicate yourself so you can speak to your parents, kind of thing. So I could at least hit the cheaper rate, but it wasn't practical for me to call them too much because I just didn't have any money. So there was a place at my university that was actually showing Scola. It was one of the libraries or something like that. And I would go there to watch the news. And since the country just quickly disintegrated, every night they would have, or every day rather, they would have the nightly news from Belgrade from the previous night. And they would also have the news from 5 days ago from Croatia. So the Croatian news, for whatever reason, from Zagreb were 5 days old. From Belgrade, they were a few hours old. And I would watch that to stay up to speed. And it was incredibly unnerving. I felt like somebody was just kind of ripping my heart to shreds. It was that hard to see my country fall apart like that. And then my dad so I had multiple cousins who ended up on the front lines. My dad was on the front line. I've had first cousins who were on both sides of the conflict. So it was just very messy because I come from a mixed marriage, ethnically mixed marriage. So that was hard. And thankfully when you're young, you can sort of compartmentalize it so that you can focus. I had to focus on my studies. I couldn't let that completely kind of consume me. Even though it was incredibly difficult to do that, somehow I managed. As far as your first question, I wasn't sure I was really interested in research because that never came up. ASU was not the kind of place where you could do research. I ended up doing an independent study with a professor, which I enjoyed a lot. It was essentially building some kind of a parser for Prolog. I forget the details of it. It was fun. It was interesting. It was new. But I didn't really get very much guidance from him. So that's different from research. Like if I basically locked my doors and didn't speak to my students, they'd quit and go, or, find a new advisor, right? And it was a very kind of hands-off approach to, maybe he wanted to see if I would just sink or swim or whatever. But I did like that project. And I realized also that at that point, going back home was not an option. So this was 1992, 1993, thereabouts. There were two wars going on in parallel, one in Bosnia, one in Croatia. I had heard all kinds of horror stories. I just wasn't ready to, it wasn't my war. It wasn't anything that I even remotely believed in. I couldn't pick a side. So I had to figure out a way of staying in the country. And in those days, the best way was to try to stay in school. And that also appealed to me because since probably an early age, there was something about a PhD that just sounded so kind of incredibly important and cool and enticing. So sort of the option wasn't really realistically there to go back, number one. And number two, it was something that I'd sort of been thinking about for many years prior to that.
You mentioned your research advisor. I want to ask a little bit about mentors and role models you've had, whether they were in school or college or later. Were there mentors and role models that really helped you? Yeah.
Yeah. So my mom was especially early on, while I was sort of, this piece of putty that somebody could form into an individual. My mom was very important in instilling a work ethic. Sometimes maybe even using draconian measures by today's standards. Where on the other hand, my dad did too. I remember once I got the equivalent of an A- because I did the whole test right. I brought it home, did the whole test right, and omitted the middle N in my first name. Just forgot it when I signed it, and the teacher basically docked me for that. I remember my dad forced me to write my first and last name 100 times. So it was, from that point on, I remembered how to write my first name. It was, I don't think I made a mistake once, right? But it was really my mom who insisted that homework be done. There was this kind of unspoken deal that I never really had a curfew as a kid, as long as I brought home good grades. And at that point, it was clear that good grades meant straight A's or the equivalent thereof. My parents basically let me do things that I enjoyed within limits, obviously. And that was, I really liked and appreciated that. It was sort of a quid pro quo in a way. They were pretty strict, but they also had expectations that I was able to meet. So in other words, this wasn't just a sort of a never-ending list of things. So my mom, in that sense, was a role model. Also, the fact that she was a woman who, in the early 1960s, went to college to become an engineer, that was kind of unusual. Then in elementary school, I had a fantastic math teacher. He was my math teacher from the 5th to the 8th grade. He left a huge mark on my life. He was somebody who kind of took me under his wing. He recognized the talent. He pushed me. We went to math competitions together and so on. So we would travel, you win the local one, you go to the state one, then you go to the federal one, we would travel and so on. And we got a chance to talk a lot. He was somebody who really left a mark in my life. And I guess that's kind of the way it sort of helps form you as an individual. By the time I got to college, I had to sort of do it alone. My host parents were definitely people I admired a lot. My host dad is a medical doctor. He's still alive. In fact, he just turned 96.
And you're in touch with them?
I'm in pretty regular touch with them. So he was somebody I could definitely look up to. He was somebody who fought in World War II in Europe, came back, finished college on the GI Bill, finished part of his medical school on the GI Bill. Kind of did everything in an accelerated fashion because there was only so much. There was 4 years of funding basically, so he had to kind of scrounge money and compress things and so on. So his story was, still to this day blows me away. He comes from a very kind of modest background and accomplished some fantastic things. So he was somebody I definitely could look up to. So I was fortunate to be surrounded by people that definitely left a kind of a positive imprint in my life.
So returning to your timeline, so you joined UC Irvine to do your PhD, and one of the reasons you said earlier was that you essentially didn't see a way to go back home to Montenegro. At what point of time did you start to like this research or think about research as a career longer term?
So almost right away, I was put on when I first came, just like every first year PhD student, you sort of figure out, you try to find your bearings, you try to figure out who's doing what and what this whole thing is all about. One of the things that I realized was that I have a lot to catch up on. So I felt like I was in a very small cohort. There were 18 of us. It was a small standalone department. It wasn't part of a school at the time. Now that department has grown into a school that within it has multiple departments. So information and computer science was just a standalone department at UCI. And I was admitted to the program with some really brilliant young people. And I felt like, okay, well, I gotta, this is just, I'm going to have to try harder. I'm going to have to catch up on some things. So I was, at ASU, I was the best student, but here I was, I was a small fish in a much bigger pond. I remember my very first winter break after the first quarter. I went back to Arizona to visit some, friends and so on. And we come back from the break, and we're chatting about who did what. And, I went to Arizona and saw a couple of football games and, went to my favorite barbecue joint and saw some friends and so on. This friend who's now working at Google, he goes, yeah, I wrote a Lisp interpreter. I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to have a little less fun and maybe a little more sort of focus here, because if Jason is doing that in his free time, what is he going to do when he actually has to work, right? So eventually, I kind of caught up with a lot of things, and on a number of fronts, and I kind of figured out exactly what my strengths were and what I could do. Found a project that I enjoyed. Found an advisor who had an interesting advising style. He wasn't very hands-on, but that actually was fine with me, because I am kind of I am driven. So I could motivate myself. That wasn't an issue, and had this really wonderful experience of being surrounded by super smart people who are all doing interesting things. And the one thing that I found at UCI that really wasn't there at ASU was this kind of almost this self-imposed pressure to try to publish. And not publish for the sake of publishing, but publish because we're trying to do good research that is of publishable quality. So in other words, do good stuff, make sure it's important, it solves real problems in cool ways, and then let's see how the world reacts to it. And that aspect of it, even to this day, really, really drives me. Of course, just like everybody else, I get discouraged and angry when I feel the reviews that come back are not what they quote unquote should be. But the fact that you're stripping yourself naked before the world every single time, you basically go, okay, this is the best that my lab is, has been able to produce, or this is the best that I'm able to produce, and then having somebody judge you on it. There is something in that process that from day one has been, it's the highest of highs. It's been incredible. The first time I had an ICSI paper accepted, I didn't even know what to do with myself, right? And then, of course, when the rejections come, it's those are some of the lowest of lows, right? So,
do you have a philosophy in dealing with rejections and more generally the imposter syndrome that many researchers suffer from?
So I am the poster child, or a poster child, of the imposter syndrome. Still to this day, I feel like, okay, well, what the heck am I doing here? I'm just not, this guy I'm looking at right now, he's better than I am. That kind of thing. It creeps in occasionally. It's some part of it, I guess, is healthy, but overall, I don't think it's a very healthy attitude and a healthy way of going through life. I wish I could get rid of it. As far as rejections go, to be honest with you, it's just to me personally, it's taken time. I don't have that arrogance that says, you know what, I'm doing fantastic work, they're wrong, I'm right. On some level, yes, I'll believe in the work, and it's necessary to kind of keep you going, but rejections hurt. So I think what's helped is that there have been so many of them over the decades that now there's kind of a nice kind of thick callus and that's formed in that whatever the part of your psyche is, so it doesn't hurt as much. That's sort of the kind of the positive outcome of it all. I also feel that it's better now in the sense that I don't have to fake it when I try to keep encouraging my students, because for them it really hurts. Like, imagine it's the first paper you ever wrote and you get reviews back that basically say this is just not good at all. Now your whole life is sort of hanging in the balance at that point. Are you doing the right thing? Should you be thinking of doing something else? Should you be flipping burgers or whatever? So I feel like now I can actually step in and explain to them why it's okay and everything is going to be fine, because I really genuinely believe it. Whereas before, especially when I was a young faculty, I would basically have to put on an act, because deep inside I would be crushed. But then I couldn't really show it to my students. So that part of it has changed. And for me, it's just been I've done this long enough where I feel like, you know what, I have had enough success that I couldn't be a total loser. Whereas early on, I did actually feel at times like, okay, well, I just had 2 papers rejected from the most important conference in the world for me, right? Am I doing the right thing? Why am I here? Should I be thinking of another career path? That kind of thing. So it still hurts every single time, but it doesn't quite, it's not a matter of life and death like it used to be.
So returning to your timeline, around the time that you're graduating from UC Irvine with your PhD, 1999, that's when the war in the Yugoslavia area is really reaching its peak. Did you at that point of time, or actually any time after that in the decade that followed, consider going back at all?
No. So the war kind of reached its peak at the most inopportune time for me. I had a baby boy. So I graduated, technically, I defended and turned my dissertation in December of 98, but the degree didn't get conferred until 1999. And in January of 99, I actually started my new job at USC. And I immediately had to start teaching, and I had to start teaching a class that had not existed before, so I had to put it together. At the same time, my mom arrived to help with my son, and that's when the NATO bombing of what we called the rump Yugoslavia, so Serbia and Montenegro, began because of the atrocities that were happening in Kosovo at the time against the Albanians. So it was on every single front. I felt like I was just basically taking on water. I was just sinking in every possible way. My home life was incredibly tense. We're not getting very much sleep because of the baby. My mom is here. My dad and sister are there. The bombs are getting dropped on them, as are all my cousins and aunts and uncles and so on. And of course, the job was very demanding, as I'm sure you remember from early on. I mean, everything is new. You're trying to figure everything out. You're trying to take on new students. You're trying to get funding, all this stuff, right? It was not the funnest part of my life. Let's put it that way. The first couple of years they really took a toll. And part of the reason I think even my marriage disintegrated was because there was just so much stress surrounding everything. And it's very difficult to figure out kind of how to deal with all of that. And then, it goes away. It kind of, you find a different path. So in the long run, it's fine. I mean, it's 1999 through, let's say, 2002, 2003. I wouldn't necessarily want to go back to that time. It wasn't I don't have the fondest memories of those years. And any one of those things would have been hard. Raising small children, difficulties in whatever your personal relationships are. Obviously, war. And then of course starting a new career as an academic, which can be very stressful. But despite that, I mean, going back was just never an option for me. I maybe I'm a minority. I know there are people who are kind of like me. There are not that many of us, but there are people who, I've spoken to who have said basically that once Yugoslavia fell apart, that was it. Like there was nothing left behind that they felt was theirs or where they felt they belong. And I'm one of those people. I know I'm a significant minority, but...
Do you get a chance to go back to Montenegro and the Yugoslavia area in the last few years? Do you go back there often?
So I used to go, before COVID, I used to go 4 or 5 times a year. My parents, kind of reached an age where health issues became a concern and so on. So I would try to go there and help out as much as I can. Since COVID, I've only been back once, and that was a couple of weeks ago, in fact, just because traveling has just been virtually impossible. And also, going to visit my elderly mom doesn't necessarily make sense if I'm actually going to make her sick, that kind of thing. So I just like everybody else, I've been sitting at home mostly for the last year and a half.
And has the country changed a lot? I'm sure it's changed a lot, of course, since you were there and you grew up. And how do you adapt to, every time you go back, you get a culture shock or a reverse culture shock?
Yeah, it's very different. So it's completely new. Nothing is the same that it was before. It is, well, for one thing, it's not one country. It is kind of the places that I generally tend to go to, it's four: Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro, Serbia. Each one of them is very different from every other one. Each one of them is, I hope that, people don't get, from that region especially, don't get angry at me for saying this, but each one of them is dysfunctional in its own way. So going back is mostly, it's fun as a way of kind of reminiscing, seeing places where I grew up and I remember from my childhood, and also seeing friends and family. Any kind of more global sort of perspective would get me deeply depressed, so I try not to think about it.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast interview with Nenad Medvidovic, computer science professor at USC and immigrant from Yugoslavia. I want to ask you a speculative question. Had you grown up in the US and gone through the US schooling system, middle and high schooling system, do you think that may have been a different experience for you, a different outcome for your career? Because you have sampled both the Yugoslav schooling system and here, so you're probably very well placed to make some responses to such a speculative question. Again, it's a purely speculative question.
So I've had 3 kids who grew up in my household who've gone through the US schooling system. And I've gotten to, maybe not firsthand, but I've gotten to see kind of how it works from day one through the end of high school. It's different. I'm not sure I would have appreciated the sort of academic or research-oriented bend to my career as much. I fear that I would have just wanted to get a degree so I can do something practical. I was always very good. I just had the fortune of being able to sort of grasp mathematical concepts, and I was able to sort of figure out how to apply them. So physics and different aspects of engineering were, that was all okay. And I think that if I'd gone through the US system, I would have maybe been driven, almost indoctrinated actually toward a more practical line of work, if you will. Not that what we do is not practical, but it's just, it's kind of pitched that way. And even the joke that I'm sure you've heard before, those who can't do teach, right? Which I kind of resent. In fact, in my experience, many of those who are the very best at doing decide to go to teach because the academic jobs are really few and far between compared to the plethora, especially in computer science, the plethora of industrial jobs that exist today. So my guess is that, for example, if I had options, if I wasn't a student on a student visa in 1998, for example, I might have just taken my master's and gone to work for, Google or Yahoo or whoever, and I might have made a fantastic decision monetarily and maybe career-wise, or it might have been something where I just believed in something and it just kind of imploded and it went nowhere, right? So in that sense, I feel like my path would have been different and more unpredictable in some ways. The career that we've chosen is relatively predictable. Like, kind of how it's going to go, and what within some envelope of possible change, how it's going to end up, right? Once you sort of get up on your 2 feet and you're sort of chugging along and
there's a cyclical nature to it. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas with industry, I have students who have changed 4 or 5 jobs within 10, 12 years after they graduated. They just kind of bounce around. And I had a student who was in a company where he left, and 2 years later the company went public, and he probably lost out. He probably would have been a multi-millionaire now. He's just doing something else. So, these are the kinds of things I can sort of see in my alternative existence, just because of I feel like the indoctrination is so strong, and I look at our undergrads even. It's very difficult to convince them that investing another 5-6 years of their lives after getting their bachelor's degree is worth their while. If the math is very simple, you get a job for $120,000 starting salary as a 21, 22-year-old. It's hard to beat that.
You have advised several successful women students, and you have several successful women in your family. I want to ask your thoughts about ideas for increasing diversity and inclusion in computer science.
Great idea. I am actually chairing my department's DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. I strongly believe in that. It may be in a weird way, it comes from the fact that I come from a mixed background, and I've known my whole life that I come from a mixed background that was drilled into me by people from the outside. And then my own kids are biracial. So I've kind of had to have a little bit of an understanding and appreciation for what it must be like for them. And my daughter is going into science, so I've also, had to think about how difficult it might be for her and what kinds of things she's had to face or will have to face that I won't because of the way I look and because of the fact that I'm a man. I actually graduated 19 students, and the 19th student, in fact, she's doing a postdoc at University of Massachusetts right now. But before she graduated, I actually had a period where I did not have any women students. And it wasn't by design, it's just that the application pools are so unbalanced, and I feel like that's part of the reason why I agreed to chair my department's DEI committee. Because I feel like there are things that we can in fact do to improve that. I right now have a much more balanced lab, and I actually feel that it's certainly more appropriate that way, and that everybody benefits from this kind of broader view of not just what computing is, but gender-based experiences, and also ethnic backgrounds and so on, because the students in CS come from all over the world. So I feel like we really have the best of all worlds in a sense, because we get exposed to so many different perspectives. But in general, it's an incredibly difficult process to reverse. I know that different universities have made headway in that regard, and there are programs that can help with that. It's just going to take time. There are things that you can do, but it's going to take time. And then one thing that I'm sure you're aware of from having served on various committees and so on, one thing that becomes, I'm sure, on some level discouraging is because there is a disbalance in the numbers of faculty of different genders. If you try to have a more representative committee of any sort, that means by definition you're actually going to put a much higher burden on, let's say, women faculty, right? Which must seem like a big disincentive to go into line of work to begin with. So somehow there's almost this natural potential for this vicious cycle that needs to be somehow stopped. It needs to be stemmed. Just like everything else, I think funding will help. But we also have to get, as a community, we have to get creative and figure out how to apply those funds and those resources. So putting resources toward this, I think, is an absolute must, even if you don't have the answers. It's not going to happen by itself. And it's not going to happen because, somebody smiles more broadly when they see a candidate from a particular underrepresented group. It has to actually, it's going to require resources, and resources mean money. So a lot of universities have to put their, money where their mouth is, and I'm happy to say actually USC has been definitely moving in that direction. Maybe it's 10 or 20 years too late, but it's happening.
Yeah, I think apart from money, I think the effort that male allies like you and others put in also is potentially going to improve the situation. Because like you said, if it's always the students in the minority groups who end up, people in the minority groups who end up doing most of the work, then it overloads them quite a bit.
Yeah. So somehow we have to balance that desire to actually have, given that we don't have a pool of individuals that's balanced, that we want these individual subgroups, like specific committees or specific bodies or boards or whatever. We want those balanced. Well, that is taxing unfairly the minority group or minority groups. There could be multiple. From the original pool where most of us are, men, right?
Okay, last question. Is there anything that we didn't cover and that you wanted to talk about?
One thing that I can say for anybody who might be listening to this and thinking about what they want to do or not to do, the best advice that I got as a very young academic in my first year of my PhD studies by John King, who eventually moved on to become dean of the business school at the University of Michigan. John basically said, if it doesn't matter what your parents want, or what your loved ones want, or any person in a mentoring capacity or whatever, if you don't want to finish, you're not going to finish. And he meant specifically with respect to the PhD, but I think it applies to many other aspects of your life. If you are not the one who wants it, in the long run, it's not, that's not a recipe for success. But if you do want it, then I think it's, as you called it before, it's okay to take a leap of faith occasionally. And I think it's okay to fail. And I think that as immigrants, we actually have this benefit of being able to fail because, kind of not really suffer huge consequences because we're expected to fail. We kind of come here with, very little. There's no history, very often very little money. We're kind of learning everything, and of course, you're not going to know upfront what's going to happen. So take a chance.
Thank you, Nenad. Thank you for your time, for your patience, and for being so open and so willing to share your very rich immigration story with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
You've heard Nenad Medvidovic on today's episode of Immigrant Computer Scientists. Stay tuned for our next episode where Jelena Mirkovic, Research Associate Professor at USC, talks about going to school in Yugoslavia during the 1990 Yugoslav Wars, and about being a woman in engineering, and much, much more. If you haven't already done so, you can listen to the lead episode of this Yugoslavia segment, that's episode 1, featuring all the 3 narrators. You can find episode guides on csimmigrant.org and find us on social media at the handle CSImmigrant. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes from the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast.